Welcome to the last week in abnormal psychology. In this chapter, we're going to look at abnormal behavior across the lifespan. So these are looking at disabilities that may occur in early childhood and could continue right on, or ones that seem to emerge at different points in one's lifetime. The psychological problems experienced by children and young people are often especially poignant, that they affect children at a time in their lives when they have relatively little ability to cope. Some problems of childhood prevent children from reaching their potential. Others mirror the problems faced by adults. Finally, there are some problems that are unique to childhood, or disorders that manifest themselves differently in children compared to adults. So what is considered normal or abnormal for children must be considered in light of developmental issues, in addition to factors such as ethnicity or gender. So what is acceptable at one age becomes unacceptable as children grows older. So we're going to look at a variety of sort of conditions, some of which you'll be familiar with, and some that you might be surprised occur in childhood. And then, of course, in part two, we'll look at more of the experiences that can occur as we get older. Alrighty then, let's get on with this, and we're on to the last of two parts, so good luck. The first neurological disorder we're going to look at in this abnormal behavior across the lifespan is autism spectrum disorder. Now this involves marked deficiencies in multiple areas of development. These deficits develop within the first few years of life and are often associated with an intellectual disability. Now, when we think in terms of the features of autism spectrum disorders, oftentimes some of the children shun affectionate behavior. They engage in repetitive and stereotypical behavior and attempt to preserve the sameness or engage in peculiar speech habits such as echolalia, which is the repetitive of words, noun reversals, and idiosyncratic speech. Now, the cause of these disorders is unknown, and it's a lifelong condition. It is a spectrum disorder, therefore there's a range of severities, and you can see this on page 338 and page 339 under the diagnostic criteria in table 11.1. Theoretical perspectives back in the 1950s, Kanner and Bettelheim, for example, looked at pathological family relationships. And that is looking at the cold, detached parent and the effect that that relationship would have on the development of autism in some children. Now, this was a common position for many psychological disorders, but research doesn't support this in blaming the parents anymore. Now, more currently, Ivar Lovaas, he's focused more on the perceptual deficits and to be able to process one stimuli at a time. Whereas cognitive therapists look at the relationship between integrating information from various senses and hypersensitivity and hyposensitivity to stimuli. This would impede what psychologists call the theory of mind hypothesis, and this is where we understand the separation and we accept the separation that there's a you and there's a me and that those are different. And with autistic children, sometimes that's blurred. That area is blurred. Now with MRI scans, we can show the differences between autistic and non-autistic brains, including the connective tissue between the two halves of the brain. These lateralization differences may also suggest a cause feature. Now we can include neurodevelopmental deficits, and in this view that there may be a genetic and therefore a chromosomal suspicion cause as well. And as you can see, and as will be consistent across the board in a lot of these lifespan disabilities, there's no cure, or at least there's not one currently. It's not to say there may not be in the future. Now, as far as treatment is concerned, intensive behavioral intervention, IBI, doesn't cure. However, These structured treatment programs have had some success, particularly when they've started early in the child's development. The biological options are limited in their success. We don't know exactly. Medication doesn't have a profound impact on the effect of autism. There have been some early successes with computer programs in teaching social skills and emotional recognition. Moving into intellectual disabilities. Intellectual disability refers to the general delay in the development of intellectual and adaptive abilities. Most cases fall in the mildly intellectually disabled range. The DSM-5 uses 3 criteria in diagnosing intellectual disability. Deficits in intellectual functioning as per standardized tests, like IQ tests, for example. 2, the evidence of impaired functioning in adaptive behavior, that is, how they interact and function within a day-to-day experience. And the onset of the disorder in a developmental period, that is, in early childhood. Now you can turn to page 392 in table 11.2 for the classification of developmental delay. Now when we think in terms of causes, Down syndrome is characterized by an extra or a third chromosome on the 21st pair. There are recognizable physical features in heart and respiratory challenges for persons with this disability. Within the population of people with Down syndrome, learning and developmental deficits occur. Other chromosomal abnormalities including Turner syndrome, where there's a single X chromosome instead of the usual 2, or Klinefelter's syndrome, where with males there's an extra X chromosome, so they were XXY. There's a variety of different sorts of conditions. Another cause for intellectual disability is what is known as Fragile X. And this is thought to be caused by a mutated gene on the X chromosome in the area that is fragile, therefore its name. It's the most common inherited intellectual disability. There are other forms that can cause intellectual disabilities. PKU, Tay-Sachs disease, or other examples that fit within intellectual disabilities. Now, savant syndrome, this refers to someone who has severe intellectual disabilities and possess a very remarkable mental ability. Now, 2 people that are fairly well known in this field, there's many actually. One is Stephen Whitshire. He has a photographic memory. He doesn't look after himself particularly well. He has a lot of other deficits, but he could be flown over a city and come back in the next week, have drawn out a very detailed drawing of what he saw from memory. You may have seen The Rain Man as a movie. Kim Peeks is who that movie is about. Kim Peeks has a photographic memory, and everything that he reads, he remembers. Plus, he has a rather remarkable way of reading. His left eye reads the left page, his right eye reads the right page. Now, if we carry on and look at some of the other factors that can influence intellectual disability, we find that some intellectual disabilities are caused by maternal infections, things like rubella, syphilis, a herpes virus that's can be a part of what may contribute to intellectual disabilities, including substance abuse, things like alcohol, where you would have alcohol fetal syndrome, or smoking. All during pregnancy can be an issue as far as developing various forms of intellectual disabilities. There are also what are known as cultural familial causes. This can include, in some cases, where there's an impoverished home, where the social environment is not very intellectually stimulating, and the parental neglect or abuse can play a role and are considered cultural familial intellectual disabilities. Children may lack toys, books, and opportunities to interact in intellectual ways. Now, as far as intervention, well, with appropriate training and support, many children and adults can participate in society in many different levels of aspects of what is normal. For many, through the use of mainstreaming, has exposed children, adolescents, and adults to normal experiences in the presence of the rest of society, and this gives them a positive role model for acceptable behavior. Another form of learning disorder, which is not an intellectual disability and oftentimes gets associated or linked because they're under the same umbrella of learning disorder, and is that of learning disorders. People with learning disorders have normal to above normal intelligence and have a specific deficit in the development of either arithmetic, writing or reading skills. Now, an example is dyslexia is the most common form of learning disorder. Dyslexia is a type of learning disorder characterized by impaired reading ability and may involve difficulties with alphabet and spelling. Now, interventions mainly attempt at remediating specific deficit skills, and the DSM-5 refers to them specifically as follows: impairments in mathematics, impairment in reading, and impairment in written expression. So if we look at some of the specifics, these are not intellectual disorders. It's important to note that these are neurological in nature, and therefore they are a measure of intelligence. If you see the reference to the Canadian definition of learning disabilities on page 400, under the subheading there of a closer look, and you'll see this sort of example. Now, the three main features of learning disorders, the first one we'll talk about is impairment in mathematics, or dyscalculia. Now, this is a very unusual, very rare learning disorder, but involves deficiencies in arithmetic skills, significant troubles in understanding basic mathematical terms and operations, things like the plus sign for adding, the minus sign for subtracting, multiplication tables and such. It's not very common, and it does not include being anxious or not liking math. That can be very debilitating, but it's not dyscalculia. You might not like math, and you might struggle with it a bit, but the difference between dyscalculia and having anxiety about math are not the same thing. Now, if we look at another, which is called the impairment of a written expression, dysgraphia is what this is called, and this is an impairment in written expression. This disorder exists even though the child may be a good reader. It can affect spelling, grammar, punctuation, or in creating sentences and paragraphs. One of the more common learning disabilities, and so it's important to note that as much as they may be able to read well, and then you see the way that they write and you go, well, that doesn't make sense, you should do better, work harder. That's the part of the learning disorder that makes it a struggle for the student as well. And then, of course, as was mentioned earlier, the impairment in reading, which is dyslexia, and there's just a difficulty in recognizing letters and words and comprehending the written text. Now, some of the theoretical perspective. Neurobiological is more and more of the research is looking at the possibility of brain dysfunction, as there are links to perceptual issues and brain dysfunctions. Genetic factors, where twin studies are supporting the genetic connection. Higher rates of dyslexia are found between identical twins rather than fraternal twins at a 70 to 40 rate. Suspicion has focused on the role that a particular gene may play in causing subtle defects in brain circuitry involving reading. As far as interventions, this leans towards supports and intervention strategies focused on the child's processing style and academic strengths, boosting the child's self-esteem, motivation, and other important skills. In schools, use of the individual educational plan and the transitional plan documents, elementary to high school and high school to post-school planning, a strategic plan for support, accommodations, compensatory skills, adaptive technology are all under consideration in the support for persons with learning disorders. This is going to bring to the end the first part at looking at abnormal behavior across the lifespan, and we'll do part 2, and then we'll be completed. Carry on and keep up the good work, everybody. Bye now.